Elisabeth and Robert need no introduction really, but Elisabeth is a curator and Sandra Gilman curator at the Whitney and co-curated this year's Biennial as well as curating the 1993 Biennial. Robert is the Dean of the Yale School of Art and curated, is the director of the 2007 Venice Biennale. I know that conversations about kind of the past biennials kind of went into formulating this biennial. That was, I think, in an interview you mentioned that was how the process started. And I thought it might be interesting to start the conversation by talking about what those conversations were like and talking about past biennials and kind of what's learned from them.
So is that directed?
Yeah, that's directed to you.
Okay. My co-curator is Jay Sanders, and he's not here, so I'll speak for both of us. But I think that both of us had come to the limit of our tolerance for biennials and art fairs, and it's as if we got this assignment to do the biennials, and we were like the worst audience of biennials, and so. Mostly our questions to the few people we talked to was, what can we do to change this, or do you feel the same way we do, or is there any reason to do another one, or they really went that way. I mean, we took this assignment on, obviously, with the hope that we would find answers to some of those questions for ourselves, but they usually started from a pretty negative base, like this was a form that wasn't working.
What doesn't work about the biennial?
For me, what wasn't working about the biennial, and particularly in the Whitney space, was that it always felt like it was crowded to the nines, that you sort of got out of the elevator and there was like this swarm of activity in front of you, that there were these little siloed rooms, too many of them that were around. And that often the lights were out and you sort of stumbled into people and looked inside and got up and walked out quickly, so you never stayed for the whole video, and there was just more than any one person could possibly take in an evening, and most people only came once anyway, so they were like chaotic and overstuffed to me now. Now I have to say that because 20 years ago, when I did my first biennial, that was a good description of my biennial. Okay. You got off the elevators, and I think you remember, Rob, you got off the elevators and there were lots of little rooms and lots of little black boxes for watching videos and so on. So I'm not saying that the form didn't work for me and maybe for biennials at one time, but 20 years later it felt very stale as a way of experiencing art.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first I'd say this biennial is really beautiful to look at, and the care that was put into thinking about the distribution of works and the coordination of works really shows. And I can understand your concern about the chocolate block, black box, white box sort of painting space, sort of sculpture floor. But I think that's a lot to do with exhibition craft, and some people have exhibition craft and some people don't, so I'm not sure that old formula is entirely passé. I think it's appropriate in certain moments when, sort of overcharged energies are exactly what you want to show, but it has to be done by somebody who actually knows how to do it. And too few people do know how to do it, and too few people who do know how to do it actually spend the time doing it, so that you have shows that are chaotic, that are detrimental to the work, that don't actually increase understanding, that are just simply, sort of potpourris of what's hot and what's not in a given moment. And that's the fault of the curator. That's not the fault of the artist. It's not the fault of the history and stuff, whatever. But I think there are moments, and there are also places. I mean, I did a section of Paulo Herkenhoff's Sao Paulo Biennale. I worked with a team to do the Sydney Biennale in 2000. There's Harry Zeman, Nick Sorota, and a bunch of other people, and I did Site Santa Fe, which is technically a Biennale, although now dead. So in addition to the Biennale in Venice, I've sort of grappled with the form in different degrees of responsibility, and I'm actually a believer in it. But for example, making clear distinctions between art fairs and biennales are like step one. If your biennale looks like an art fair, you've blown it.
You mentioned a potpourri of what's hot and what's not. is there a kind of obligation to represent what is kind of the state of contemporary art? Is that something that, because people like go to a biennial expecting to see something like that, and how much is that a obligation that the curator has, responding to in a biennial?
Well, I'll just, since I raised it, I think it depends on where the Biennale is. If you're doing a Biennale in places where there is relatively little art flow and where institutions are weak, I'm just reading a PhD thesis of one of my students from the IFA who's writing about the creation of Sao Paulo Biennale, which was a great event and which was a very troubled beginning, but has had a long and interesting history. It was designed for a place that was underserved both by galleries and by institutions. And in those circumstances, probably the responsibility of a curator of a Biennale is to do more by way of representation, more by way of a sort of articulated description of the scene, as opposed to the kind of thing you did in this show and other people don't know shows, which is to deliberately take certain parts of the equation and focus very hard on qualities or sensibilities or attitudes, that are just a part of the scene, but a particularly interesting one in the configurations you choose. That's the luxury of people who live in places where there's a lot of art around, so that the contrast between sort of the normal flux and something that crystallizes certain qualities becomes very much the point of the Biennale.
I agree partly that when I worked in Boston for many years at the ICA, we felt that Boston was underserved and that it was our duty to bring in as much as possible and turn over art rapidly. And so there was a kind of, at the ICA then, there was a kind of constant Biennale going on of that sort as a way of doing just what Rob said. But I think I now feel that it's less important to show what's hot than what feels important. I don't think it would be my obligation as a curator to say this is the hottest thing going on right now and I'm going to show it because it's hot. If I disliked it or if I felt it didn't have any impact on me, so I would feel no obligation to show what was hot unless it had sufficient emotional or visual impact.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it seems like there are the expectations placed on a biennial are so extreme. There's so much weight placed on it that it's almost really difficult for people to respond to it. And I went back and read some of Arthur Danto's criticism recently, and he didn't see a biennial he liked ever. I think in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. How do you feel about those kinds of expectations that are placed on it?
Well, I think it's the rightful mindset in a way that the exhibition, here in New York and the oldest running biennial, it's never going to, in a way, it's never going to fulfill the expectations of what it could or should be to everybody. Never, never, ever. So that's why the reviews have been somewhat shocking, and you kind of have to get on the other side of the fence and say, well, why was that review written?
Mm-hmm.
Because really the biennial is kind of constructed to disappoint people. I mean, it has to, in a way. It's just the nature of the beast. I mean, to a greater or lesser extent, it always disappoints.
Mm-hmm. Both of you, is that something to take into consideration when curating a biennial?
Well, pleasing Arthur Danto has never been a top priority, even though he's a good writer and an interesting man. I don't think if you try to play to your critics or against your critics, you're ever going to get it right. And I think you have to think about what it is that you think matters at a given point and what you think your audience would benefit from seeing. And the way you're sort of a first responder, you have access to much more art than most people do. And if you see something that is of note, and you think the rest of the public would benefit from seeing it, even if they don't necessarily like it, but that it weighs enough that it's worth their time and attention, that becomes then the beginning of the process, at least it does for me. And I'm always shocked by New York criticism in general, but criticism at large, that takes the lowest critical common denominator, and then hammers it. Rather than saying, if somebody did this, why would they do that? I mean, you did the Political Biennial in '93, which, was a controversial show by definition, but it was also an interesting show. And the amount of ink that was spilled over that one to sort of be outraged that anybody should do a political show, particularly in those years, and after all this stuff we've been through, was just like ridiculous, right? So to understand that the premise is a legitimate premise, that the work can be unequal or uneven, but that there's something going on, and to try to read those patterns was an effort that very few of the critics made. But then, of course, Peter Sheldon, who hates politics and art, even though he obviously has his own politics, or Arthur Dante, who is more tolerant of politics and art, but likes things that don't disturb him too much. And here's a guy who doesn't like Bruce now because Bruce is not nice. That kind of thing.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the times when people didn't want to participate, and what you learned from that, or what you thought was going on.
I guess in some cases, in one case, I won't mention the artist because he's very well known, but I have a reputation for doing political shows, and I think he was leery of being caught up in a show which had a political static around it, right? And it's a person who has their own politics and whose politics are, not conservative in any way, but who just sort of wanted to be clear of all of that altogether. Sometimes it's also that people are just in troughs in their work and they're just not ready to show, so that although you offer them this occasion, whether or not they've been in one before, you just don't hit that right moment and they back away. And there are some artists who don't like doing what they conceive of, and many people conceive of as sort of Biennale type art, who don't want to do something that is deliberately spectacular or so on, which doesn't mean that that's necessary or required, but they see that as the trap and they avoid it.
With the Whitney Biennials, there are people tailoring their work to the exhibition format?
Not this particular time, but just listening to what Rob was saying, I was thinking the one person that we did have difficulty for all the above reasons getting into the biennial was Mike Kelly. And I had worked with him in the past and many times, and actually had seen him and talked to him about this question of what's wrong with the biennial, early on in the planning process. And I thought he was in a position in his career, because he had these big exhibitions where he wasn't doing the kind of work, and I think he agreed that should be included in the biennial, much as I think he was one of the greatest American artists of all times. But so we sort of left it that I wouldn't push him to be in the biennial, that it was the wrong moment for him to be in a biennial. And then we went to Detroit to look for art, and when we were in Detroit, people began to tell us about Mike's project that he had done for Detroit, where he was born. And the project was so incredible, and we asked to see whatever parts we could, which he had captured on video. So he sent us the video, and the video was just some of the best work he had done ever. And so we went back to him, we said, Mike, we don't want your gallery art that you've been doing. It's the wrong time, wrong place for it, but we do want this video that's part of Detroit. So then he suffered from this situation that Rob was talking about. What would be spectacular enough? How could I really make this spectacular enough? And that just, because he was in such a bad state of mind, the idea that he had to do something spectacular because it was a biennial really discouraged him. And so we had to talk him out of it and say, no, this biennial we're working on is not a spectacular biennial at all. We want just good, interesting work, and just these videotapes you've done are just fine. You don't have to do any of the big spectacle. And so he had all kinds of ideas for making the spectacle, but he had no real desire to do it, and we didn't want to have it. So it took a long time to talk him into being in the biennial in a non-spectacular way, but it worked, and then, yeah.
Do you think part of that is because of where he was in the process with Art Angel and the Olympics coming up and the pressure for the Olympics, and where does that sort of fit?
The Art Angel project and the Olympics are something separate, right?
A little bit?
Tell us more about that. You know more than I do, because
I mean, I was talking to the woman who heads up the visual arts then for the Arts Council, who's involved with it. And she was saying that Michael had a separate stage in the process then leading on from the Art Angel work. That would be part of it, but that might actually be delayed now because of what happened with the work in Detroit and where it sort of went. So I just wonder if there was also this, if he has in his mind that he's thinking about another stage or what might have been to happen for something that would be, in terms of the Olympics, which again is another sort of level of spectacle, but then the biennial as well. I mean, that puts, an interesting question on where the work is going and, how much room do you have to let it develop at those stages or what it means for that next stage.
Yeah, no, all that is in play around this Mike Kelly and spectacularization and process and all that. So,
and all that
yes.
watching.
Yes.
It seems like this sort of movement towards spectacle, particularly in New York museums, has been a successful formula for at least attracting the general public. And you were saying with this biennial that it wasn't meant to be a spectacle. Was the museum conscious of this as maybe it negatively impacting how many people will enter this biennial?
Actually, it's had many more than we had for the last biennial. So, and it's hard to know what's drawing them exactly. But it didn't set out to be about non-spectacle. I mean, had Charles Ray come and said he would do another fire truck or something like that, I wouldn't have said no. But but it just turned out people that we were interested in just weren't kind of interested in that. And and it's a very sensitive subject with museums, this whole idea of spectacle and entertainment, I think, very sensitive. So to play for it so that you can get crowd, if you're only doing it to get crowds, it's obviously a very corrupted idea. But pretty active, do you think? Or
No, I mean, I'm not somebody who hates spectacle in principle because Du Bois said it was bad. But a lot of the reasons that Guy Debord said it was bad, I think, are legitimate reasons, i.e. it makes people passive and non-participatory and so on. So, if you allow that certain artists have the gift for spectacle and other artists do not, and if you allow that there are many things that art can do that have nothing to do with spectacle, then you can create a mixed program, a mixed grill, and whatever it is. And if the museum is well run, it varies its speed in such a way that it makes sure that one project, in a sense, pays for the other project. That you have your blockbuster and you do it well, and then you have your non-blockbuster and it's supported by the success of the one which is blockbuster. I think what's going on now, though, is that museums are driven particularly by boards to think that everything has to be a blockbuster. And it's parallel to the publishing industry and actually the record industry. It used to be that, in the days of yore, basically, that symphony orchestras were paid for by pop music. Frank Sinatra paid for, Eugene Ormandy or whoever it was. And then the accounting system shifted, and then everything had to pay for itself, which is crazy, because not everything can pay for itself if museums are run well. And that's where the trouble begins, this kind of accountancy. The show that I did with Tony Smith, which we didn't have any money to put up until the last month, I guess it was, before the show actually went up, which was expensive because we did the garden with massive sculptures and we did part of the public parks and in front of the Seagram's building. That was essentially subsidized by, I can't remember what the last great, money-making exhibition, but maybe Matisse or something like that. And the museum understood that this was how it was going to shift its expenses and deficits around, but if museums don't think that way, then they're boxing themselves in, because then you get the phenomenon, which is also like the big entertainment industry. You get all the money poured into, say, John Carter, right? And then you get a bust.
Is there a museum that you would point to that you think has a really great balance?
A great what?
A great balance.
No comment.
Other questions?
I mean, the Walker Museum, for example, in Minneapolis, which is an interesting example of a small museum with a very strong and steady patronage network that did some spectacular shows and a lot of wonderful sleepers in a very isolated place, and often did shows that the big museums in the city didn't touch, like the Othosika show and so on. That's a case of a museum which was really well run and where things were in scale and where blockbusterness or spectacle was a minor part of the equation, but showmanship, which I think is different than spectacle, the ability to make a show that people want to come and see, was a major part of what they did, and they did it very well.
This kind of ties in with the notion of spectacle in exhibitions. It seems like so much of the dialogue around biennials is kind of premised in, theory and history and that sort of thing. But where is the place for aesthetics in, major museum shows these days, like biennials?
Well, it's funny because aesthetics is sort of not a word that I kind of feel good about using. But on the other hand, I think maybe you're saying something else, that theory-driven, conceptually oriented shows seem to be standard fare. And
that's not really what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not implying that. I do feel that it's turning out that way. Which is why I'm wondering, where do you have any personal aesthetic positions or yourself?
Well, I guess you'd have to, that's a shifting target, what your aesthetic position is. And I'm a person who, I guess, curatorially, if you kind of look at what I've done, that I like people who are very involved with materials, like Eva Hess. I worked on her. I like photography that's deeply emotional. I worked on Diane Arbus. I did this highly political 1993 biennial. So, and I think of myself, I think of all those positions as being part of my shifting aesthetic position, but also I see consistencies from one to the other, and in this exhibition that I've just worked on, there seems to be a kind of intimate feel about some of the visual art that's on display, and I think, and an eccentricity, and I think that's part of how I feel. So but I couldn't reduce that to saying what my aesthetic was and that I would privilege it. I do sort of feel like my tolerance for what I would call just outright cynicism and irony and backstory conceptualism is very limited now.
I'm not sure that I'm getting this right, but I think when you use a word like aesthetics, there's a sort of a ghost opposition to it, and in terms of recent critical discourse, obviously it's the anti-aesthetic, and the sort of idea that there's a political awareness of the world versus an awareness of the world which is formalist and self-indulgent and doesn't allow for it, or conversely, the aesthetic view of the world is that people who think politically think only instrumentally about politics and therefore ignore the complications of the aesthetic and therefore downplay it. I think these are false dichotomies to begin with, and I think you talk to almost anybody who sticks by those terms and you will find where the argument falls apart. If you say that there has to be a perceptual or experiential component, sensual component to the work, that is of a certain quality, complexity, efficiency, whatever it is, then the answer is clearly yes. If there's a certain conceptual and perhaps political quotient, also yes. And really the best art has both of them. That was essentially what my Biennale in Venice was about. It was to break down these separations and to put work that was highly charged in some political social dimensions along with work which was anything but, and to show that there were resonances and at least the possibility of coexistence, and that belaboring these dichotomies this late in the history of modernism is a waste of everybody's time, and it also blinds you to experiences which are available on both sides of the line. So I have a sensibility of my own. I've looked at a lot of art, and I try to find stuff to show other people that is at a level of sophistication, perceptually and formally, that merits their time. I also try to do the same thing on the conceptual side, but a Ryman painting and I don't know what, a Naumann performance and a Richter painting and so on are not interchangeable. It's just they're all so good that if you're going to have complicated attitudes toward these things, these are the examples you should be thinking about, as opposed to some other examples which are less complicated.
I'll preface my question by saying I came a little late, so I don't know if it's been covered, but I'm interested to know, there's a lot of ideas and thoughts about how to change biennials and what makes biennials better or worse. As curators, what is I guess, your single most important goal? Is it to educate the public? Is it to document a certain period in time? Is it to push the envelope, so to speak? What would be your, obviously it's very hard to prioritize, but what would be your pinnacle goal in curating biennial?
We have gone over some of that stuff, but I guess for me at this moment in time, it would be to touch people somehow, to somehow break through, if not with everything in an exhibition, with something in an exhibition, so that it was either, sort of a drop-dead visual experience, or it was something that was taking place in time, or something that really got to people, that was direct and passionate enough in its feeling that it sort of broke through. And almost no one says no to you. And so it's only lack of imagination that keeps you from going to people. And I mean, one of the weirdest people we went to was Werner Herzog. But we said to ourselves, well, people are talking about Werner Herzog, let's go find him. And so we did. So, and Werner Herzog didn't say no. It's like, it's like you're only limited by your own imagination when you're doing one of these shows. You have a great card in your hand to open doors to almost anybody. You have, if the project's interesting enough, you can probably raise money for it. So it's only your limitations of your own thinking that keep you from finding a lot of interesting stuff.
Well, I will say, that short of having a Biennale that's sort of thesis-driven and about a curatorial concept in a rigid way, it does make a difference to a lot of people what the thrust of a show is, and whether they want to participate will be somewhat determined by whether or not they're in any way, whether their mind resonates against what it is that you're trying to do. And I had some people who, I asked them, and they said, no, I don't know whether it was that or not, but it was an interesting conversation to have come out of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the biennial this year, Andrea Fraser described her contribution as trying to participate and not participate at the same time.
Right. That was very interesting, because she takes this very clear and intelligent view of the art world at this point, and the kind of 99%, 1%, and how the art museums are running on 1%'s money, and how the criticism that's coming out of it from curators like myself and critics is all kind of left-leaning against the 1%. So she kind of sets that up as the impossible situation that it is. And at the same time, she acknowledges that she went to the Whitney Independent Study Program, and that she herself has been nurtured to some extent by these kinds of institutions that she criticizes. So she's very honest about the problems.
Mm-hmm. Is that something that also the curator needs to be involved in critiquing the form? You were mostly talked about the layout, kind of in critiquing the way that biennials have failed in the past. Is there more to it than that in terms of in responding to what Andrea Fraser was trying to do with the biennial format?
Well, I think that the biennial could have done that, for sure. I mean, we were putting that biennial together at the height of Occupy Wall Street, and there's only one artist that's in the show that's even, directly reflecting that situation. So I think we reached a point in our discussions, Jay Sanders and I, where when we felt there were really strong, valid, activist political things that were going on in the art world, focused on Occupy Wall Street, let's say, and that to aestheticize them and to pull them into the kind of biennial structure that was developing with us would be to be giving them a kind of home in the wrong place in a way. They belonged in this more activist format that they were finding in the world.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, Robert, for example, curating an international exhibition like the Venice Biennale, is as a curator, how do you put together a international exhibition and try to discover artists like that?
I guess because I was very privileged because I'd been at the Modern, I'd been able to travel quite a lot in the years preceding doing the show. And a lot of people had come to me from places that I hadn't been, but I got to know them and got to know the scene a little bit through them. But I insisted, the Biennale came to me and said, we would like you to do 2 Biennales back to back. We'd like you to do the first one in a year and the second one in 3. And I said, no, I can't, one person can't do that in any way. I had a job at Yale which wouldn't allow me to do it. So I'll say, I'll give me 2 years to do the first one, and I'll do the second one after that. But then I insisted that they give me money to travel properly, which they weren't really prepared to do. So I actually raised a lot of money so that I could travel. And I sort of, I'd have like weeks where I'd be at Yale for 3 days, and then I'd get on a plane and go to Bucharest and come home Sunday night and go back to work at Yale, and then do it until Wednesday, and then go to Buenos Aires and do it like that and come home. So I did a lot of sort of fast checking on things, with airplane tickets, and spent the summers traveling. But I resolved early on not to do a representational, not to say there should be so many artists from here or so many artists from there. There were certain kinds of, I called it a tuning fork, but there were certain resonances that I wanted. And I was looking for work that in some ways was in tune with those things. And I looked as many places as I physically could. But because Venice has national representation, I didn't feel it was incumbent on me to sort of, as I used to say, do kind of the UN of art, where everybody gets represented in some proportional way. That was really not my job. But I was attentive to precisely what you said. Look in places where underrepresentation was crying out, not because there were good people living in these places and they deserved recognition, but because there was good art in those places that deserved recognition.
It was interesting this year that the biennial and the New Museum Triennial, of course, were both happening at the same time, and the New Museum Triennial took on this like very overtly global, kind of approach. And one of the themes of the Whitney Biennial was this kind of old, weird America, inspired by Greil Marcus a little bit. And how did you feel about having those 2 different approaches kind of in the city at the same time?
Oh, I felt fine. I mean, we didn't trade notes, and we only turned out having 1 artist overlap actually. So that was interesting. But the intentions were so different, and it's funny that idea about the old weird Americas out in the world. I don't know quite how it got out there, but it's true. Is it on some interview or something that I
think that it was in an interview.
That's so great. That's so great. And today I took Greil Marcus around the biennial.
Okay.
And so anyway, I didn't ask him whether it fulfilled his idea of old weird Americas. I don't think it does, because what's happening in the biennial that I've worked on is that it's changing all the time. And so when we got off the elevator on the 4th floor, which is the big performance space, the Michael Clark dancers were all working out to Jarvis Cocker. And so it didn't seem really like the old middle America up there at all. But they're places. When we went down to the Forest Best Room, for sure, I think that's still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And speaking of that kind of rotating, constantly changing, biennial format, that's also like a strategy you're using, right, to kind of change the way the biennials have been done in the past.
Yeah, well, we had seen these incredible performances, and so we took this idea of what has American art, been doing, what's it been up to in the last 2 years, to mean art in all these different forms, and these were some of the great things that we saw. And when we talked to Sarah Mitchelson, the dancer, and Richard Maxwell, the the theater director, both of whom are going to be in this series, they both went up to the 4th floor and they said, "Give me this, just give it to me." And we showed them the building just at the moment when the Paul Tech show was coming down and the whole floor was open, and they said, "We don't have to do anything, we'll just stand here in this space, and just whatever happens in here, it's going to be great because the space is so great, just give it to us." So we did. Because I've been at the institution for so long, I had to take this to the director, and the director didn't ask me too many questions. He said, "You can do it. If you can afford to do it, you can do it." So he didn't grill me about that. He was good, and he let us do it. So, and everybody has been worried because there are moments when you go up to the 4th floor and the elevator opens and it's wide open space and nothing's happening. So that it just takes some getting used to, but it really does reconfigure your experience, and that's what we were hoping for.
You spoke a little bit about the Venice Biennale, and you just talked about having open space on the 4th floor at times. And one thing that I really love about the Venice Biennale is seeing all the buildings that were constructed specifically for that purpose by every country, and that the architecture kind of comes into play with every exhibition every 2 years. Is that something that could enhance biennales in general if they've commissioned specific buildings to house the art every 2 years? I know that's like a...
Well, Documenta did that in, whatever it was, 92, I guess it is. They did a series of pavilions, which were very beautiful, and then came down immediately after the show, but it is very expensive to do. And there are not many places which have free space that you could devote to this. I mean, obviously the Whitney doesn't have a parking lot to fill up with new buildings, and I think the tendency is to adapt buildings in underused parts of cities, as they do in Istanbul, as they do in Havana and other places, and to do it that way. To start from scratch with a whole set of pavilions really, I mean, I don't think there's any biennial now that's properly funded. Maybe, I don't even know if the Whitney is, but there's none that's properly funded. And there are several people with innovative concepts for biennales who've really been shortchanged to the point that the biennale is broken down. So utopically, yes, that would be nice. Also, in Venice, I used to say this and made people in Venice very upset. I said, basically, this is a graveyard of nationalities. It's like La Recoleta in Buenos Aires or Père Lachaise in Paris. These are mausoleum-type structures in honor of a certain idea of nationalism, coincident with the moment that the building was built and the invitation was extended. So you have the Hungarian one, which is one of my favorite pavilions, but it's this Magyar Art Nouveau thing. And to see Joseph Cassuth, for instance, in that pavilion was like so many levels of intertextuality, or whatever you want to call it. It was just wild. And in a way, that's part of the charm of Venice, but you would never on purpose do that again, right?
Really?
And I don't think one should do it again, because I don't think the role of nation states in relation to art is what it used to be.